Hello, thank you for joining us. We begin our report with President-elect Donald Trump selecting two loyal allies for key roles in his administration. Trump has chosen Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz for Attorney General and former Hawaii Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. Trump's cabinet is quickly taking shape, with the president-elect elevating some of his most vocal supporters on Capitol Hill and cable TV. Earlier, Trump met with his soon-to-be predecessor in the Oval Office. President Biden welcomed him back to the White House, where they spoke privately for about 2 hours with their respective chiefs of staff. The two men exchanged a few quick words in front of the White House press corps.
Mr. President-elect and former President,
thank you.
Donald, congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And looking forward to having a, like we said, smooth transition.
Politics is tough, and it's in many cases not a very nice world, but it is a nice world today, and I appreciate it very much. A transition that's so smooth, it'll be as smooth as it can get, and I very much appreciate that, Jude.
The meeting of the incoming and outgoing presidents is a tradition to facilitate the peaceful transition of power. It did not happen in 2020, as Trump was contesting the results of that election. Meanwhile, we now know Trump will have an easier time moving his agenda through Congress. CBS News projects Republicans will retain control of the House. The party also flipped the Senate in last week's election. Let's bring in CBS News Chief Washington correspondent Major Garrett. Major, thanks for being here. I want to ask you about some of the latest cabinet picks by Trump. But first, on the White House, how would you characterize that interaction between Trump and Biden? I doubt either of them have the other on their holiday card list.
Probably not, but it is power present meeting power future. At the center of that interaction, America's ongoing interests, domestically and internationally. It's an important thing for presidents to do with presidents-elect. President Biden extended this courtesy, which is not just courtesy, it's not just ritual, it's about signaling to the world continuity in American governments. President Obama extended that to President-elect Trump. The one who did not was President Trump. Did not extend this courtesy, did not recognize this ritual, did not convey this continuity of American governance when he was in office in 2020 for the reasons that you described. His disputed objection to the 2020 results, though he clearly lost, and President-elect Biden was entitled to all of the courtesies, rituals, and governance aspects that he gave to President-elect Trump today. That's what is distinctive about this. It was extended to President-elect Trump twice. When he had the choice, he did not extend it himself.
Let's talk about Trump's picks. He's selected Florida Congressman Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. As you know, Gaetz has been the subject of a House ethics investigation into alleged sexual misconduct and drug use, among other controversies. What do you make of that choice for him to lead the Justice Department, and what can we expect him to do as AG?
Well, it was shocking even to those within the Trump inner circle. And not only is Congressman Gaetz the current subject of a House Ethics Committee investigation, he was for a period of time the subject of a Department of Justice investigation launched when President Trump was in office. And we learned later, during the course of that Department of Justice investigation, Matt Gaetz preemptively requested a pardon from then President Trump. I don't think in the annals of American history we've ever had a circumstance where someone nominated to be the next Attorney General of the United States had, under previous circumstances, requested a preemptive pardon during an ongoing federal criminal investigation. But here we are. And it is quite clearly from President-elect Trump a sign to his most ardent supporters that he is willing to break a lot of China here in Washington to signal his willingness to be disruptive. Will the Senate Republicans, in particular, now in majority, welcome that disruptive turn toward Matt Gaetz? The early readings are not so fast.
Well, former Democratic Congresswoman and Army reservist Tulsi Gabbard is Trump's pick for Director of National Intelligence. She left the Democratic Party, campaigned for Trump. What do we know about how she would approach that role?
She also ran for president as a Democrat in 2020 and criticized in one debate then candidate Kamala Harris from the left. It was interesting. They had a lot of interactions in that one memorable debate before both of their candidacies for the Democratic nomination in 2020 ran to ground. Tulsi Gabbard also, in 2017, met with the Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad, who was visibly being supported at that time by Russia and Iran. Those kinds of things will very much get the attention of senators, considering her confirmation to be the director of national intelligence. But she is a Trump loyalist. She is one of those in the Trump inner circle, or the Trump orbit, rather, who is very much opposed to U.S. interaction, U.S. use of military force in conflicts or to resolve conflicts. She wants America to stay at home and husband its defense resources, use them only when necessary. And she's also taken a dim view of ongoing support to help the Ukrainians repel the Russian invasion. All of this will be subject to her confirmation hearings. She also falls into the category of surprising picks, ones that will probably face some manner of tough sledding in the confirmation process.
But Major, if the Senate does away with sort of the traditional confirmation hearings and Trump gets what he wants in terms of recess appointments, could both Gaetz and Gabbard eke by without support from the Senate?
The Senate would have to agree to recess and then sit idly by and let then President Trump, because he would have assumed the office by this time, use recess appointments. That would be an institutional handing over of power without any precedent in American history, not in the Senate, not in any Congress ever constructed, and it would be a laying down, essentially, by Senate Republicans to any and all requests of President Trump, including those that flow entirely through their constitutional powers of advise and consent. It is theoretically possible. I can't imagine it happening, but I've been surprised before in this era.
You know, Major, a lot of Trump's picks don't have experience leading a government agency. Pete Hegseth, for example, defense secretary, he spent the last decade as a television personality. But Trump markets himself as an outsider. He markets that he'll bring in outsiders. Is this what his base voted for? In part, because his base has basically come to the conclusion that most of the things that land comfortably in the nation's capital are basically wrong and injurious to either their interests or America's interests broadly. They may or may not be right about that, but that they believe it is a fact. But the thing you mentioned is most important. Pete Hegseth was on television a long time, on a network that Trump watches a lot. And all of his potential picks are being viewed based on their credibility, their qualifications, but most, if not, well, maybe not most importantly in every case, but in many cases, the decisive factor is how good and how trained are you on television? Trump prizes that nearly above everything else, right alongside loyalty. So television experience, for good or ill for this country, is an important marker of potentiality in the Trump transition. How well can they communicate his message? Major Garrett, thank you.